The snow beneath her boots crunches with a sound that seems too loud in the pre-dawn silence. Sarah Mitchell stops walking, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air of the North Cascades. She's been hiking since 4 in the morning, desperate to catch the sunrise from Cascade Pass, but now something makes her skin prickle with a fear she cannot name. The trail ahead is unmarked by other hikers, which isn't unusual for late October, but what catches her eye makes her heart hammer against her ribs. There, crossing the path just 20 feet ahead, are footprints unlike anything she's ever seen. Each impression is nearly 18 inches long, pressed deep into the fresh powder, showing 5 distinct toes and a heel that suggests something walked here on 2 legs. But no human foot could create such marks. The stride length between them spans nearly 6 feet, and the depth suggests a weight that would crush a man. 7,000 miles away, on the same morning, Tenzing Dorje finds something that makes him drop his climbing rope. The Sherpa has guided expeditions up these Himalayan slopes for 30 years, but the scene before him defies everything he knows about this mountain. Fresh blood stains the white snow in arterial spray patterns, still bright red in the thin air. Scattered around the crimson snow are tufts of white fur, each strand as thick as yak hair but longer, coarser, belonging to no animal he recognizes. The tracks leading away from this kill site are massive, humanoid, purposeful. Something killed here in the last few hours. Something that left prints heading higher up the mountain, toward the death zone where no sane creature ventures. 2 continents, 2 witnesses, 2 sets of impossible footprints, and a question that has haunted cryptozoologists, hikers, and mountain guides for generations. Are these the same creature, or are we sharing our world with 2 separate apex predators that science refuses to acknowledge? The stories we tell ourselves about Bigfoot and the Yeti have become so intertwined in popular culture that most people assume they're simply different names for the same legendary beast. But those who've encountered these creatures, those who've survived to tell their stories, know better. They speak of fundamental differences, of distinctions that could mean the difference between walking away with your life and becoming another statistic in the growing list of unexplained disappearances in remote wilderness areas. 6 key differences separate these cryptids. 6 crucial facts that might save your life if you ever find yourself face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The habitat they choose, the way they hunt, the evidence they leave behind, their relationship with humans, the sounds that precede an attack, and finally, the most disturbing difference of all, one so shocking that it challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. But before we reveal what separates the Bigfoot of the Pacific Northwest from the Yeti of the Himalayas, you need to understand something critical. Both creatures have allegedly killed. Both have left behind evidence that authorities struggle to explain. And both continue to stalk the remote places of our world, places where humans venture at their own risk, places where the normal rules of nature seem suspended. Understanding the difference between these 2 cryptids isn't just an academic exercise for monster enthusiasts. It's survival knowledge. Because if Sarah Mitchell in the Cascades treats her encounter the same way Tenzing Dorje should treat his in the Himalayas, one of them won't make it home. The strategies that might save you from one creature could get you killed by the other. So, stay close. Pay attention. Because what we're about to reveal comes from decades of research, from witness testimonies that span continents and centuries, from blood evidence and footprints, and recordings that skeptics cannot explain away. The truth about what walks in our wildest places is more terrifying than any legend, and far more complex than you ever imagined. Albert Ostman never wanted to tell his story. For 27 years after it happened, he kept silent, knowing how ridiculous it would sound, how people would dismiss him as crazy or a liar. But in 1957, something changed. Perhaps it was the weight of carrying such an impossible secret, or perhaps it was the growing number of similar reports emerging from the Pacific Northwest. Whatever the reason, Ostman finally spoke, and what he described would become one of the most detailed accounts of Bigfoot behavior ever recorded. It was the summer of 1946 when Ostman, a Canadian lumberjack, decided to take a prospecting vacation on Vancouver Island. He ventured into the dense temperate rainforests near Tuba Inlet in British Columbia, seeking gold and solitude in equal measure. The forest there breathes with an almost oppressive vitality. Douglas firs tower 300 feet overhead, their massive trunks wrapped in thick moss that drips with constant moisture. Sword ferns carpet the forest floor in waves of green, so dense you cannot see the ground beneath them. The canopy filters sunlight into a perpetual green twilight, and the air itself feels thick, laden with oxygen and the sweet decay of endless organic matter. This is an environment of abundance, where salmon choke the streams each autumn, where berries hang heavy on bushes throughout the summer, where deer and elk browse in meadows ringed by impenetrable walls of cedar and hemlock. Ostman had camped for 3 nights without incident, enjoying the solitude and searching for mineral deposits. But on the 4th night, something lifted him from his sleeping bag, treating both man and bedroll as a single package. Still groggy and disoriented, trapped inside his sleeping bag like a chrysalis, Ostman could only feel the motion as whatever had grabbed him carried him through the forest. He described the journey as lasting approximately 3 hours, a relentless march through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate in darkness. When he was finally dumped on the ground and managed to extricate himself from his sleeping bag, dawn was breaking, and Ostman found himself in a small valley surrounded by steep walls. More importantly, he found himself face to face with a family of 4 Sasquatch. An old man, an old lady, a young man, and a young woman. What followed was a 6-day captivity that, if true, offers unprecedented insight into Bigfoot behavior and their relationship with their forest environment. Ostman described the creatures in meticulous detail. The adult male stood approximately 8 feet tall, covered in brown hair that was darker on the chest and lighter on the face. The eyes were small and black. The females were shorter, perhaps 6 to 7 feet tall, with longer hair. What struck Ostman most was their comfort in this environment, their absolute mastery of terrain that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. The young male could scale cliff faces with ease, moving through thick brush without making a sound. The family foraged constantly, returning with roots, grasses, and what Ostman believed were varieties of wild onions and sweet spruce tips. They drank from a spring and seemed to have an intimate knowledge of every plant, every shelter, every route through their territory. The old man, whom Ostman identified as the patriarch, seemed particularly interested in keeping him captive, positioning himself at the only easy exit from the valley. Ostman noticed that while the creatures were immensely strong and clearly capable of violence, they showed no aggression beyond the initial kidnapping. They communicated with chattering sounds and gestures, and they seemed curious about their human captive rather than hostile. This raises a fascinating question about Bigfoot behavior in these abundant forest environments. Do they experience less competition for resources, less need for territorial aggression, because their habitat provides so generously? The forests of the Pacific Northwest offer everything a large omnivore might need. The salmon runs alone provide millions of pounds of protein each year, washing upriver in waves of silver flesh. Berry crops ripen in succession from early summer through fall. The forests teem with small mammals, insects, birds, roots, tubers, fungi die. The mild temperatures mean survival does not require elaborate shelter or stored food supplies. An intelligent creature adapted to this environment might indeed develop the kind of curious, relatively non-aggressive behavior Ostman described. The Lummi Nation, whose traditional territories encompass parts of Washington state and British Columbia, have long spoken of Siatko, the forest giants who avoid humans but sometimes take an interest in them, particularly the young ones. Lummi elders describe Sasquatch as protective of their territories, but not violent unless threatened, creatures who live in family groups and move through the forest with purpose and intelligence. This stands in stark contrast to accounts from the opposite end of the cryptid spectrum, in an environment so different it might as well be another planet. On November 21, 1925, a Greek photographer named N.A. Tumbazi was conducting a photographic expedition in the Sikkim Himalayas, working at altitudes where the very air becomes an enemy. At approximately 15,000 feet, near the Zimu Glacier, his Sherpa porters suddenly stopped and pointed. There, moving across a steep slope of rock and ice, was a figure unlike anything Tumbazi had expected to encounter. He watched through binoculars as what he described as a large bipedal creature traversed terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers. It moved with purpose, seemingly unaffected by the thin air that left Timbazi and his team gasping. The figure was dark against the snow, covered in reddish-brown hair, and it walked upright with a stooped posture. Timbazi observed it for approximately 1 minute before it disappeared behind a ridge. When the team reached the location 15 minutes later, they found footprints in the snow, distinct and large, showing clearly separated toes. The environment where this sighting occurred defies human comprehension of what should be habitable. At 15,000 feet in the Himalayas, the oxygen content of air is roughly 40% less than at sea level. Temperatures plunge to dozens of degrees below freezing. The terrain consists of rock, ice, and thin patches of hardy grasses. There are no forests, no berry bushes, no salmon runs. Animal life is sparse and specialized. Snow leopards, blue sheep, pikas, and birds adapted to extreme altitude. The question that haunts researchers is simple and profound. What could possibly survive there, and why? The Sherpa people call it Mito Kangmi, the man-bear of the snows. Their accounts, passed down through generations, describe a creature fundamentally different from the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch. The Yeti is solitary and aggressive, protecting a vast territory in an environment where food sources are scattered and precious. Sherpas speak of Mito Kangmi attacking yaks, occasionally threatening humans who venture into its domain, displaying a ferocity born of desperate survival in a land that offers nothing freely. Where Bigfoot can afford to be curious and relatively tolerant because food is abundant, the Yeti cannot afford weakness or sharing. Every calorie matters at altitude. Every meal might be the difference between surviving another month or perishing in the endless snow. The physiological adaptations required for each environment tell a story of divergent evolution if both creatures exist. Bigfoot in the temperate rainforest would need size and strength, but not extraordinary metabolic efficiency. The environment provides. A large body mass helps with dominance and reaching high food sources. Intelligence helps with varied foraging and avoiding humans. But the Yeti faces challenges that would require biological miracles. Enhanced lung capacity to extract oxygen from thin air, perhaps similar to Tibetan highland adaptations in humans. Increased muscle myoglobin to store oxygen. A metabolism that can switch between periods of abundance and severe scarcity. Thick hair for insulation, but also behavioral adaptations like seeking caves and rock shelters that the rocky Himalayan terrain provides. Where Bigfoot can sleep in tree nests or simple forest shelters, the Yeti must find protection from killing winds and cold that could freeze flesh in minutes. The behavioral differences reported by indigenous peoples reflect these environmental pressures. Lummi accounts describe Sasquatch as curious about humans, sometimes leaving gifts or warnings, occasionally stealing food or tools, but rarely directly threatening people. The encounters that do turn violent usually involve humans surprising a Sasquatch or threatening its young. The creatures seem to prefer avoidance, vanishing into the forest depths where humans rarely venture. They are described as foragers and opportunists, eating whatever the season provides, from fish to berries to deer. Sherpa stories of Mito Kangmi paint a darker picture. The creature is a hunter, a predator that must be to survive. It takes livestock not playfully, but desperately, needing the calories that the barren landscape denies. It reacts to human presence with aggression, because in its world, competition means death. There is no abundance to share, no extra food to allow curiosity. The Yeti must defend its territory absolutely, because another large predator in the same range would mean starvation for both. Some Sherpas describe Mito Kangmi as following human expeditions, perhaps scavenging whatever scraps or yak carcasses are left behind. Others tell of Yetis attacking solitary travelers, though whether this is predation or territorial defense remains unclear. The hunting patterns attributed to each creature reveal this environmental split. Bigfoot sightings often involve reports of fish being taken from streams, deer found with broken necks, berry patches stripped clean. The pattern suggests omnivorous opportunism, taking whatever presents itself most easily. The forest provides so many options that specialization is unnecessary. Intelligence applied to foraging in such an environment would yield abundant rewards. But Yeti accounts suggest a different strategy. Ambush predation on blue sheep and Himalayan tar, scavenging from snow leopard kills, raiding human livestock when possible. and perhaps extended periods of dormancy or hibernation, when food becomes impossible to find during the harshest winter months. Ostman's account includes a detail that seems to confirm the environmental abundance theory. He described the Sasquatch family eating constantly but without urgency, sampling various plants and roots, almost browsing like the deer that share their forest. They showed no food aggression, no desperate hoarding. The young female even approached Ostman and gestured as if offering him some kind of root vegetable. This is the behavior of creatures living in plenty, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more food. It is impossible to imagine Timbazi's Yeti clinging to existence on a frozen mountainside, displaying such casual generosity. The oxygen difference alone explains much. The Pacific Northwest forests sit at or near sea level, where oxygen saturation allows for large body size and high activity levels without evolutionary pressure for extreme efficiency. Large muscles, big brains, and constant movement are all sustainable. But at 15,000 feet and above, every breath delivers less oxygen. Evolution would favor smaller body size, lower metabolic rates, and behavioral patterns that minimize energy expenditure. Yet the Yeti is consistently described as large, perhaps even larger than Bigfoot in some accounts. This suggests either an evolutionary path that prioritized size for heat retention and predation despite the oxygen cost, or physiological adaptations we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps lung capacity double that of humans, or blood chemistry that binds oxygen with impossible efficiency, or cells that function in low oxygen conditions that would render a lowland creature unconscious. The temperature ranges add another layer. British Columbia forests rarely experience extreme cold. Winter temperatures might drop below freezing, but nothing compared to Himalayan conditions where -40 degrees is routine. Bigfoot would need only moderate hair coverage and perhaps seasonal behavioral changes, moving to lower elevations or changing diet with the seasons. The Yeti lives in permanent winter, where exposed skin would suffer frostbite in minutes and where finding liquid water can be as challenging as finding food. These environmental pressures shape not just physiology, but psychology. The Lummi speak of Sasquatch as having rules, as being spiritual creatures who understand boundaries and respect. This could reflect a social structure made possible by environmental abundance. Family groups, territories large enough to avoid constant conflict, behavioral complexity that requires brain development, which requires calories which the forest provides. The Sherpas speak of Nato Kongmi with more fear than respect, as a force of nature more than a thinking being, though some accounts do suggest intelligence and cunning in its hunting strategies. If both creatures exist, they represent evolution's answer to radically different questions. How does a large primate thrive in paradise? It becomes intelligent, social, and adaptable, taking advantage of endless resources while avoiding the one predator that could threaten it: humans. How does a large primate survive in hell? It becomes fierce, solitary, and willing to take risks that forest creatures never need to take. Ostman eventually escaped by offering the old man Sasquatch a tin of snuff tobacco, which the creature eagerly consumed and then apparently choked on, creating enough confusion for Ostman to grab his rifle and flee. The family did not pursue him. He emerged from the forest with a story he would not tell for decades, a tale of creatures perfectly adapted to their green cathedral of a home, secure and curious in their abundance. Timbazi took photographs, though the figure was too distant for detail. He made notes and sketches. He collected testimony from Sherpas who spoke of regular encounters with Metokangmi in the high reaches where humans rarely venture. His account stands as one of the most credible Yeti sightings precisely because of its restraint, its scientific approach, its acknowledgement of what he could not explain. Two environments, two creatures, two different answers to the question of how something large and human-like might exist unseen in the modern world. The forest hides its giants in green shadows and endless space. The mountain hides its monster in thin air and impossible altitude. And both environments continue to guard their secrets, offering only footprints and fleeting glimpses to those brave or foolish enough to search. On a cool October day, 1967, two men crouched behind fallen timber in the dense forests of Northern California, their movie camera capturing what would become the most analyzed, debated, and scrutinized piece of footage in cryptozoology history. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were filming what appeared to be a massive bipedal creature, striding purposefully through a creek bed at Bluff Creek. The being moved with an uncanny fluidity, its muscles rippling beneath thick, dark reddish-brown fur that seemed to shimmer in patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy above. When the creature turned to glance back at the camera, that single moment of eye contact would ignite decades of fierce controversy and scientific examination. The Patterson-Gimlin film, as it came to be known, reveals a creature standing somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall, with shoulders so broad and muscular they suggest a build far exceeding any human proportions. The being's gait displays a unique combination of power and grace, with long pendulous arms swinging in rhythm with its stride. Frame-by-frame analysis has shown muscle groups flexing and relaxing beneath what appears to be genuine fur, creating shadows and highlights that special effects experts have struggled to explain away. The creature's fur appears thick and shaggy, darkest along the back and shoulders, lightening slightly along the flanks and extremities to a burnt sienna tone that catches the dappled forest light. The facial structure visible in those precious few seconds shows distinctly ape-like characteristics. The brow ridge protrudes prominently over deep-set eyes, creating shadows that make the creature's expression difficult to read. The face appears flat and broad, with a wide flat nose and a jawline that juts forward in what primatologists recognize as a prognathic profile, similar to that of a gorilla or other great ape. The overall impression is one of raw, primitive power, barely contained within that massive frame. The creature's head sits atop those enormous shoulders, with minimal neck visible, giving it a hunched, powerful silhouette that has become iconic in Bigfoot literature and popular culture. Cryptozoologists studying the Patterson-Gimlin footage have noted the creature's apparent adaptation to the dense, temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. The dark coloration would provide excellent camouflage in the shadowy understory of old-growth forests, where massive Douglas firs and western red cedars create perpetual twilight even on sunny days. The muscular build suggests a creature capable of navigating steep, rugged terrain and potentially overturning logs and rocks in search of food. Some researchers have theorized that such a build would be ideal for a large omnivore operating in an environment where food sources can be widely dispersed and seasonal. Contrast this hulking, gorilla-like being with the creature suggested by mountaineer Eric Shipton's photographs taken thousands of miles away in the frozen heights of the Himalayas. In 1951, Shipton was leading a reconnaissance expedition on Mount Everest when he encountered a line of massive footprints pressed deep into the snow of the Menlung Glacier at an elevation exceeding 18,000 feet. The tracks measured approximately 13 inches long and 8 inches wide, with what appeared to be 5 distinct toes clearly visible in the crisp imprints. Shipton carefully photographed the tracks using his ice axe for scale, creating images that would become foundational evidence in the study of the creature known variously as the Yeti, the Abominable Snowman, or the Maigoak. The tracks suggested a creature far different from the being captured in the Patterson-Gimlin film. Analysis of the stride length and depth of the impressions indicated a being standing perhaps 5 to 7 feet tall, significantly smaller than the Bigfoot specimen. The narrower stride suggested a more slender build, a creature built for endurance and efficiency in the thin air of high altitudes rather than raw power. Sherpa guides and local villagers consulted about the tracks described encounters with a creature covered in white or light gray fur, sometimes tinged with reddish highlights around the face and shoulders. This lighter coloration would serve as natural camouflage against the snow-covered peaks and glacial ice fields where sightings most commonly occur. Beyond the tracks, descriptions from Himalayan locals paint a picture of a creature with surprisingly human-like facial features. Unlike Bigfoot's flat, ape-like visage, witnesses described the Yeti as possessing a more vertical face with a prominent pointed cranium that rises to a cone-like peak. This conical skull, mentioned repeatedly in accounts spanning decades and multiple mountain ranges, suggests a sagittal crest similar to that found in male gorillas but more pronounced and elongated. Such a structure would provide attachment points for powerful jaw muscles necessary for chewing the tough, fibrous vegetation available at extreme altitudes. The Yeti's reported facial structure includes a more defined nose, sometimes described as slightly hooked or prominent rather than flat and ape-like. The eyes are said to appear more forward-facing and expressive, creating an unsettling impression of intelligence and awareness that many witnesses find deeply disturbing. The brow ridge, while present, appears less pronounced than that of the North American Bigfoot, giving the face an appearance that falls into that uncanny valley between human and ape that many find more frightening than either extreme. One of the most compelling photographic accounts came from Anthony Wooldridge in 1986, when he encountered what he believed to be a Yeti on a remote Himalayan slope. Wooldridge, an experienced trekker and photographer, spotted the figure standing motionless against a snowfield at a distance he estimated to be several hundred yards. Through his telephoto lens, he observed a dark shape that appeared to be watching him with equal attention. The being stood upright with a posture that struck Wooldridge as eerily human, yet the proportions seemed subtly wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. The head appeared large and oddly shaped, rising to a point that created a distinctive silhouette against the white background. Wooldridge described an overwhelming sense of alienness emanating from the figure. This was not simply an unknown animal, he later reported, but something that seemed fundamentally out of place in our understanding of the natural world. The being's stillness was absolute, without the small, fidgeting movements characteristic of humans or known primates. It simply stood and observed, creating a tension that Wooldridge found increasingly unbearable. He took several photographs before the figure finally moved, not walking away but seeming to sink or crouch behind a ridge and vanish from view. Later, analysis of Wooldridge's photographs proved frustratingly inconclusive. Skeptics suggested he had photographed a rock formation, though Wooldridge insisted the object had been mobile and clearly biological. The physical differences between Bigfoot and Yeti reflect fundamental adaptations to radically different environments. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest offer abundant food sources, from salmon runs in rivers and streams to berries, roots, and the occasional deer carcass. A larger, more powerful build would be advantageous for a creature operating as an apex predator or dominant scavenger in such an environment. The ability to overturn logs to access grubs and insects, to wade into swift rivers to catch fish, or to defend kills from bears and mountain lions would all favor size and strength. In contrast, the high Himalayan environment offers far fewer calories spread across a much more hostile landscape. The thin air at elevations above 15,000 feet makes every movement more costly in terms of energy expenditure. A smaller, more efficient body plan would be essential for survival. The lighter coloration reported for Yeti specimens serves dual purposes, providing both camouflage against snow and possibly reflecting solar radiation in an environment where overheating during strenuous activity could be as dangerous as cold exposure during rest periods. Primatologists examining these differences have proposed various evolutionary scenarios to explain how two related but distinct species might have developed. Some theorize that both creatures descended from Gigantopithecus, an enormous ape that lived in Asia until relatively recently in evolutionary terms, perhaps surviving until 100,000 years ago in isolated pockets. As populations became separated by geography and climate change, different selective pressures would have driven divergent evolution. The ancestral population that migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into North America would have encountered rich forests and abundant game, favoring larger size. Those remaining in the Himalayas would have been pushed to higher elevations as human populations expanded in the lowlands, forcing adaptations to extreme altitude and cold. Other researchers suggest the creatures might represent separate evolutionary experiments, perhaps both descending from smaller common ancestors, but evolving along parallel paths in response to similar ecological niches on different continents. The bipedal stance, large brain capacity relative to body size, and apparent tool use reported in some encounters could represent convergent evolution, similar traits arising independently in response to similar environmental challenges. The musculature visible in the Patterson-Gimlin subject suggests adaptations for power rather than endurance. The thick, heavy limbs and massive shoulder girdle indicate a creature built for explosive strength, capable of short bursts of tremendous speed and force. Biomechanical analysis of the creature's gait reveals a walking pattern that efficiently conserves energy during normal movement while maintaining the capacity for sudden acceleration when necessary. This matches the behavior pattern reported by witnesses who describe Bigfoot as generally unhurried and deliberate, but capable of vanishing into thick brush with startling speed when alarmed. The Yeti, based on track evidence and reported sightings, appears built along different lines. The stride length and depth variation in snow tracks suggest a creature that moves with careful deliberation, testing each footfall before committing its full weight. This would be essential behavior for an animal navigating terrain where a misstep could mean plunging through a snow bridge, into a crevasse, or triggering an avalanche. The reported slender build and longer limbs, relative to torso size, would aid in heat dissipation during exertion, while minimizing surface area for heat loss during rest periods, a crucial adaptation for life in extreme cold. These physical differences extend to the hands and feet as well. Bigfoot tracks typically show a broad, flat foot with relatively short toes, sometimes displaying what appears to be a mid-tarsal break that allows the foot to flex in ways human feet cannot. This would provide superior grip on steep, muddy slopes and help distribute weight when moving across fallen logs or unstable ground. Yeti tracks, in contrast, often show longer, more separated toes with what some researchers interpret as evidence of a partially opposable big toe, similar to that of known apes, but adapted for gripping in snow and ice rather than grasping tree branches. As evidence accumulates and analytical techniques improve, the picture of these creatures becomes simultaneously clearer and more complex. Each new piece of data, whether photographic evidence, track casts, or witness testimony, adds another dimension to our understanding while raising fresh questions. The stark physical differences between Bigfoot and Yeti suggest we may be dealing with distinct species, shaped by millions of years of evolution in dramatically different environments, each perfectly adapted to its domain, yet sharing enough commonalities to suggest a shared ancestry lost in the depths of time. The cold mountain air carried something unnatural that night in July of 1924, when Fred Beck and his 4 companions huddled inside their crude cabin on the slope of Mount St. Helens, listening to the nightmare unfolding outside their door. What began as a single rock thudding against the wooden walls quickly escalated into a siege that would last through the darkest hours, forever marking the canyon below with a name that speaks to primal terror: Ape Canyon. The attack that night would become one of the most documented and debated violent encounters between humans, and something that, according to witnesses, moved with terrifying purpose and unmistakable intelligence. Beck and his fellow miners had come to this remote section of Washington state searching for gold, not answers to questions about what might share these forests with them. They had been working their claim for several weeks when they began noticing signs that something was watching them. Tools would go missing from where they had been carefully placed. Strange vocalizations echoed through the trees after sunset, sounds that resembled no animal any of them could identify. Massive footprints appeared in the soft earth near their camp, prints that measured over 14 inches long and showed 5 distinct toes. The men discussed these oddities around their evening fire, attempting to rationalize what they were experiencing, but rationalization became impossible after the encounter that preceded the attack. The afternoon before the siege, Beck claims he spotted one of the creatures standing near the edge of a small canyon, watching the miners work. He described it as standing upright like a man, but covered entirely in dark hair, with arms that hung past its knees, and a face that combined human and ape-like features in a way that struck him as profoundly wrong. Acting on instinct or fear, Beck raised his rifle and fired. The creature fell backwards over the canyon rim, tumbling into the ravine below. Whether Beck actually hit his target or whether the being simply fled, he could not say with certainty, but what happened next suggests the bullet found its mark, or at least that the creatures perceived a deadly threat from the humans in their territory. As darkness settled over the mountain that evening, the miners secured themselves inside their cabin, a structure built from rough-hewn logs with a single door and one small window. They had finished their meal and were preparing for sleep when the first rock struck the cabin wall with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Then another rock hit, and another, a bombardment that came from multiple directions simultaneously. The men grabbed their rifles and positioned themselves to defend the cabin, but what they saw through gaps in the walls defied everything they thought they understood about wildlife behavior. Multiple creatures surrounded the cabin. Witnesses later estimated between 7 and 10 individuals working in coordinated fashion. Some threw rocks while others attempted to find weaknesses in the structure, testing the door, clawing at the logs, reaching through any gap they could exploit. The miners fired their weapons through the walls, aiming at shadows and movement, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating figures that moved with shocking agility for their size. Beck described one creature climbing onto the roof, its weight causing the support beams to groan and crack. The beam began tearing at the shingles, trying to create an opening large enough to enter from above. Only sustained rifle fire through the roof drove it back. The attack continued for hours, demonstrating a level of persistence that suggested these creatures were not simply curious or opportunistically scavenging. This was purposeful aggression, possibly retribution for the shooting earlier that day, possibly territorial defense against human intrusion, or perhaps both. The miners noted that the creatures appeared to communicate with each other through a series of whoops, howls, and what Beck described as a kind of chattering vocalization. They seemed to coordinate their assault, with some creating distractions, while others attempted breaches at different points. This was pack behavior, organized and strategic in a way that implied social structure and shared purpose. When dawn finally broke over the canyon, the creatures withdrew into the forest, leaving the miners shaken but physically unharmed. The cabin, however, bore the scars of the night's violence. Rocks littered the ground around the structure, some weighing as much as 20 pounds. Deep gouges marked the door and window frame. Portions of the roof had been torn away. The men gathered what supplies they could carry and abandoned their claim that very morning, descending the mountain and reporting their experience to authorities in the nearest town. Most dismissed their account as hysteria or fabrication, but the physical evidence at the cabin site was harder to explain away. The Ape Canyon incident represents one end of a behavioral spectrum that becomes even more intriguing when contrasted with encounters from the other side of the world, where different cryptid exhibits markedly different responses to human presence. In 1986, legendary mountaineer Reinhold Messner was trekking alone through the remote regions of eastern Tibet when he experienced his own encounter with what locals called the Yeti. Unlike the aggressive pack assault that terrorized the miners of Ape Canyon, Messner's experience revealed a creature that seemed almost as startled by the meeting as the human was. Messner describes rounding a rocky outcrop at dusk and finding himself face to face with a large, hair-covered biped standing approximately 200 feet away. The creature was solitary, with no indication of others nearby. It stood motionless for what Messner estimated as 10 to 15 seconds, regarding him with what he interpreted as curiosity rather than aggression. The being showed no signs of territorial defense or threat display. Instead, after that brief moment of mutual observation, the creature simply turned and moved away, disappearing into the mountainous terrain with remarkable speed and sure-footedness. No vocalizations, no aggressive posturing, no attempt to approach or intimidate. The Yeti, in this instance, chose withdrawal over confrontation. This pattern of solitary avoidance-oriented behavior appears consistently throughout the majority of documented Yeti encounters. Witnesses describe lone individuals spotted at a distance, creatures that flee when detected rather than standing ground. The rare occasions when Yetis have been reported in pairs typically involve what observers interpret as a mother with offspring, suggesting family units that separate once the young reach maturity. There are virtually no credible reports of Yeti pack behavior, no accounts of coordinated group activities, and certainly nothing resembling the sustained, organized assault witnessed at Ape Canyon. The behavioral contrast extends to communication methods as well. Audio recordings attributed to Bigfoot, analyzed by researchers and sound engineers, reveal a sophisticated repertoire of vocalizations. The famous Sierra sounds recordings from the 1970s capture what appear to be conversations between multiple individuals, with varying vocal patterns suggesting different speakers. These recordings include low-frequency howls that carry for miles, likely serving as long-distance communication to coordinate group movements or establish territorial boundaries. Equally significant is the widespread documentation of wood-knocking behavior, where Bigfoot creatures reportedly strike trees with branches or rocks to create loud percussive sound. Witnesses describe these knocks occurring in patterns, with answering knocks coming from different locations, suggesting a form of acoustic communication that allows group members to maintain contact across distances while moving through dense forest. The Yeti's reported vocalizations tell a different story. Witnesses describe high-pitched screams or whistles, sounds that lack the variety and apparent complexity of Bigfoot communication. These vocalizations seem designed to warn or startle rather than to coordinate or communicate detailed information. Some researchers who have studied both phenomena suggest the Yeti's simpler vocal patterns align with solitary behavior, where complex social communication becomes unnecessary. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for these behavioral differences comes from visual documentation and thermal imaging. The Marble Mountain footage, captured by a hiker in Northern California, shows what appears to be a large bipedal figure on a distant ridge. Analysis of the footage reveals not one, but potentially 3 individuals moving through the same area within a short time frame, suggesting coordinated travel. Thermal imaging studies conducted in suspected Bigfoot habitats have captured heat signatures consistent with large primates moving in small groups, typically 2 to 4 individuals. These thermal images show the beings maintaining proximity to each other while traversing difficult terrain, behavior that implies social bonds and cooperative movement patterns. Investigators have documented what they interpret as evidence of Bigfoot family structures. Footprints discovered at various sites show size variations consistent with adults and juveniles traveling together. Witness accounts frequently describe seeing larger individuals accompanied by smaller ones, with the larger beings appearing to guide or protect the younger. This family group structure parallels great ape behavior observed in gorillas and chimpanzees, species known for their complex social hierarchies and cooperative child rearing. The implications of these behavioral patterns for understanding intelligence and potential danger are profound. Pack behavior requires cognitive abilities that go beyond simple survival instinct. The coordination displayed during the Ape Canyon attack suggests planning, role assignment, and shared objectives. The creatures demonstrated problem-solving abilities, attempting multiple breach points when initial efforts failed. They showed restraint as well, choosing to withdraw at dawn rather than continuing the assault into daylight hours. This combination of aggression and tactical thinking points to intelligence on par with or exceeding that of known great ape. The solitary Yeti, by contrast, displays intelligence suited to independent survival. Messner noted the creature's immediate assessment of the situation and efficient retreat, suggesting quick decision-making and knowledge of escape routes. The avoidance behavior indicates learning from previous encounters or cultural transmission of information about human danger. A solitary creature must possess all survival skills individually rather than relying on group knowledge, possibly requiring different forms of intelligence than pack-living species develop. These behavioral differences also shape the level of threat each creature potentially poses to humans. A territorial pack willing to sustain an hours-long assault represents a significant danger, particularly to individuals or small groups venturing into remote areas. The Ape Canyon miners were armed and fortified, yet barely survived the encounter. An unarmed hiker surprised by a group exhibiting similar territorial aggression would face catastrophic odds. The pack's willingness to engage rather than retreat suggests confidence in their ability to prevail in confrontation. The solitary avoidant Yeti presents a different risk profile. While any large, powerful creature possesses the capacity for violence, the consistent pattern of withdrawal rather than engagement suggests these beings pose minimal threat to humans who respect their space. The danger likely increases only when the creature feels cornered, or when protecting offspring, standard defensive behaviors seen across mammalian species. What emerges from examining these patterns is a picture of 2 distinct entities, shaped by their environments and evolutionary pressures. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, rich with resources and capable of supporting multiple large animals in close proximity, may have fostered the development of social Bigfoot groups. The harsh, resource-scarce environment of the Himalayas might favor solitary Yetis that require less food and avoid competition through isolation. Or perhaps we are seeing evidence of fundamentally different species that, despite superficial similarities, evolved along separate paths leading to radically different behavioral outcomes. The question of what these creatures are, whether they exist at all in physical form, or represent something else entirely, remains unanswered. But the behavioral patterns reported across decades and continents reveal something essential about the human need to categorize and understand the unknown. We project onto these beings the characteristics that frighten us most. The pack that hunts with purpose and intelligence. The solitary watcher that observes from the darkness before vanishing. Each represents a different manifestation of our ancestral fear of predators and the wild places we can never fully control. Long before Western explorers set foot in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest or scaled the icy peaks of the Himalayas, the people who lived in these lands knew something moved through their territories that defied simple explanation. These weren't mere animals to be cataloged and studied. They were beings that existed at the edges of the known world, where the physical realm brushed against something older, something that demanded respect and silence. The Salish peoples of the Pacific Northwest have carried knowledge of Sasquatch through countless generations, knowledge that predates written language and stretches back into the mists of time that Europeans would call prehistory. But to call these beings simply forest creatures would miss the fundamental truth of how indigenous cultures understood them. Sasquatch, known by various names across different tribal nations, occupied a space between worlds. The Lummi Nation referred to them as Chemaques, while the Yakama knew them as Watitas. Among the Coast Salish, speaking the name of these beings was itself a violation, an act that could draw unwanted attention from entities that were best left undisturbed. The spiritual framework surrounding Sasquatch reveals a worldview fundamentally different from Western scientific materialism. These beings were understood as guardians, watchers who moved between the physical and spiritual dimensions, with an ease that made them simultaneously present and absent. Tribal elders would teach the young that certain places in the forest were not meant for humans, that there were boundaries maintained by these guardians that should never be crossed. The thick cedar groves where light barely penetrated, the high alpine meadows where the trees grew twisted and strange, the deep ravines where the sound seemed to die before it could echo. These were the domains of Sasquatch, and to enter them without proper respect and purpose was to court disaster. The taboos surrounding these beings were severe and specific. Among many tribes, hunting Sasquatch was absolutely forbidden, an act that would bring catastrophe not just to the individual, but to the entire community. To harm one was to tear the fabric that separated the worlds, to invite chaos into the carefully maintained balance between human settlements and the wild places. Elders would tell of warriors who violated these prohibitions and were never seen again, or who returned as hollow shells of themselves, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed or experienced. But the relationship was not one of simple reverence. Woven through the spiritual respect was a thread of very real fear. A recognition that these beings were dangerous in ways that went beyond physical threat. Stories passed down through generations spoke of Sasquatch taking women from villages, particularly during certain times of year when the veil between worlds grew thin. These weren't tales told to frighten children, though they certainly served that purpose. They were warnings based on what tribal historians insist were actual events, disappearances that followed patterns, that occurred in specific locations, that left behind evidence the communities recognized even if outsiders dismissed it. The Spokane tribe tells of a creature called Sitko, a being that would steal children who wandered too far from the safety of the village. Mothers would use these warnings to keep young ones close, but the elders knew the stories had roots in genuine tragedy. Children had vanished in these forests, taken in the night or disappearing during gatherings of roots and berries, leaving behind only footprints too large to be human, and a silence that felt alive with malevolent awareness. Halfway around the world, in the shadow of the highest peaks on Earth, Sherpa communities and Tibetan Buddhist practitioners developed their own complex understanding of a similar mystery. The Yeti, known as Magoi in Tibetan, occupied a space in the cultural consciousness that blended the physical with the metaphysical in ways that made Western categorization nearly impossible. Ancient monastery paintings depicted these creatures not as simple wildlife, but as embodiments of spiritual principles, representations of the untamed aspects of consciousness that Buddhism sought to understand and transcend. In Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, the wilderness itself was seen as a reflection of the wild mind, the unenlightened consciousness that needed to be tamed through practice and discipline. The Yeti emerged from this framework as both a literal creature that left footprints in the snow and a manifestation of those aspects of reality that resisted human understanding. Monks would perform ritual dances wearing Yeti costumes, embodying the wild energy while simultaneously demonstrating the potential for its transformation. These weren't pantomimes or entertainment. They were spiritual practices designed to engage with forces that were very real, whether one understood them as purely internal psychological states or as external entities. But alongside the philosophical sophistication was the same current of fear that ran through Pacific Northwest tribal knowledge. Sherpa communities living at the edge of the habitable world knew the Yeti as something genuinely dangerous. Stories accumulated over centuries of yaks found torn apart, killed with a violence and strength that no known predator could match. The wounds were different from those left by snow leopards or wolves. The animals had been broken, twisted, killed with what seemed like rage rather than hunger. Worse were the stories of human encounters, tales of travelers who went into the high passes alone and never returned, or who came back speaking in fractured whispers of something enormous and terrible they had glimpsed through the snow. Sherpa guides would refuse to take certain routes, would insist on camping in specific protected locations, even when it meant hours of extra travel. They knew which valleys were safe and which ones belonged to something else. During the early days of Himalayan mountaineering, Western climbers would often dismiss these warnings as superstition, the irrational fears of simple people who lacked scientific education. Expeditions would push into areas the Sherpas advised against, and sometimes those expeditions encountered things they couldn't explain. Footprints, measuring 16 inches long, found at altitudes where no known large mammal should exist. Camp supplies scattered in ways that suggested something had searched through them with almost human purpose. And occasionally, the disappearances. Climbers who left camp and vanished completely, leaving no trace despite the snow that should have held tracks, despite the limited area where a person could have gone. The dismissal of indigenous knowledge by Western science created a dangerous gap, a blind spot where cultural understanding could have prevented tragedy. When tribal elders warned researchers not to venture into certain areas, when Sherpa guides insisted that some peaks were forbidden, they were drawing on centuries of accumulated experience. But the Western scientific model required empirical proof, required evidence that could be measured and cataloged according to specific methodologies. Traditional knowledge, oral histories, spiritual frameworks, all of this was categorized as folklore, interesting from an anthropological perspective, but not to be taken seriously as actual information about the physical world. This epistemological arrogance had consequences. In the Pacific Northwest, missing persons cases clustered in certain areas, patterns that local indigenous communities recognized but that law enforcement and park services struggled to explain. Experienced hikers would vanish in regions the tribes had marked as dangerous for generations. Search parties would find nothing, or would find evidence that made no sense. Tracks that appeared and disappeared impossibly. Personal effects scattered in ways that suggested the person had been moved through terrain they could not have crossed on their own. The cluster of disappearances in areas around Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, and throughout the Cascade Range followed patterns that seemed random to outsiders, but that fit precisely with the territorial maps tribal knowledge had established over centuries. These were the boundary zones, the places where Sasquatch was most active, where the spiritual and physical worlds pressed most closely together. To those who carried the old knowledge, the disappearances were tragic but not mysterious. They were the predictable result of violating boundaries that modern culture no longer recognized existed. In the Himalayas, similar patterns emerged. The number of inexplicable disappearances in certain valleys and along certain routes exceeded what could be attributed to avalanche, exposure, or falling. Sherpa communities would speak quietly among themselves about which losses were natural mountain dangers and which were something else, something the Yeti had claimed. But these distinctions were not recorded in official reports, were not entered into the databases that tracked mountaineering fatalities. The darker elements of these traditions reveal beings that were not benign nature spirits or simple undiscovered primates. They were entities with agency, with apparent intelligence, and with capacities that made them genuinely dangerous to humans who entered their domains without proper protection or understanding. Some tribal accounts describe Sasquatch as territorial in ways that went beyond animal aggression. as if they actively policed the boundaries between human and wild spaces, punishing violations with a calculated ruthlessness. There are stories, carefully preserved in oral tradition, of Sasquatch that would mimic human voices, calling out in the darkness, using the voice of a loved one to draw people away from the safety of their camps. These accounts appear across different tribal nations who had no contact with each other, suggesting either a shared truth or an eerily consistent pattern of experiences. People would hear their child crying in the forest and run toward the sound, or hear their spouse calling for help and rush to respond, only to be led deeper into the wilderness, their own voices eventually joining the chorus of lures used to trap others. The Tibetan accounts spoke of Yeti that displayed similar cunning, that would wait along common routes and attack when travelers were most vulnerable. Exhausted from days of high-altitude climbing, judgment impaired by oxygen deprivation, the creatures seemed to understand human weakness, to exploit it with the intelligence that suggested more than animal instinct. What makes these traditional accounts most disturbing is not just the content, but the consistency across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The Pacific Northwest tribes and the Himalayan communities developed remarkably similar frameworks for understanding these beings despite no historical contact. Both cultures established taboos around speaking certain names. Both recognized specific territorial boundaries. Both understood these creatures as existing between physical and spiritual dimensions. Both accumulated histories of disappearances and violence that followed predictable patterns. When Western science finally began to take these creatures seriously as potential zoological discoveries in the mid-20th century, it approached the question with a framework that had already dismissed the most important data. The spiritual context, the territorial boundaries, the behavioral patterns described in traditional knowledge. All of this was set aside in favor of finding physical proof, a body or bone, that could be examined in a laboratory. But the traditional knowledge suggested that such proof might be impossible to obtain, that these beings existed in ways that made them fundamentally resistant to that kind of documentation. The result has been a continuing pattern of disappearances, encounters, and unexplained events in the exact regions that indigenous knowledge identified as dangerous hundreds of years ago. The warnings are still there, preserved in cultural memory, but they are treated as curiosities rather than critical safety information. And so people continue to vanish in the deep forests and high mountains, continue to encounter things they cannot explain, continue to learn too late that the old stories were not metaphors, but maps of a reality far stranger and more dangerous than modern culture is prepared to accept. In the basement of a police forensics laboratory in Texas, fingerprint expert Jimmy Chilcutt bent over a plaster cast with mounting excitement. The ridges he was examining shouldn't exist, at least not according to conventional science. Chilcutt had spent decades analyzing fingerprints, developing an expertise so refined that law enforcement agencies across the country sought his consultation. But in 2000, he agreed to examine something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about primate dermatolithics. The object before him was one of thousands of plaster casts collected since the 1950s, allegedly showing the footprints of a creature science insists cannot exist. The story of Bigfoot's physical evidence is a bewildering maze of compelling data and spectacular fraud, of scientific anomalies and human deception. Since that pivotal moment in 1958, when Jerry Crew made the first widely publicized casts of mysterious footprints at Bluff Creek, California, thousands upon thousands of similar impressions had been collected from forests across North America. These casts now fill private collections, university archives, and the storage rooms of dedicated researchers. They vary in size from 14 inches to an astonishing 24 inches in length, showing what appears to be a flat-footed bipedal creature of immense weight and stature. What captivated Chilcutt wasn't merely the size of these impressions. It was the presence of dermal ridges, those tiny raised lines that create unique patterns in primate skin. In legitimate casts, these ridges flow in patterns distinctly different from human prints, exhibiting characteristics Chilcutt claimed were consistent across multiple specimens from different locations and time periods. The ridge flow patterns, he noted, ran horizontally across the foot rather than vertically, as in human prints. More intriguing still, The ridge width averaged 0.6 millimeters, sitting between the typical measurements for humans and known great apes. Chilcutt's analysis brought a veneer of scientific credibility to a field desperately seeking validation. Here was a court-recognized expert, someone whose testimony had convicted criminals, now stating that these casts showed evidence of an unknown primate. He examined prints from various locations, including the famous Skookum cast from 2000, a large impression allegedly made when a Bigfoot sat or laid in mud, leaving impressions of its body. Chilcutt identified what he believed were dermal ridges on the heel portion of this cast, patterns he insisted could not be easily hoaxed. Yet the scientific community remained unconvinced, and for understandable reasons. Creating fake dermal ridges is not impossible, merely difficult. Skeptics pointed out that natural textures in skin, fabric, or even certain casting techniques could produce ridge-like patterns. Without a body, without DNA that definitively identifies a new species, footprint casts remain circumstantial at best. They prove someone or something made an impression, nothing more. The hair samples present an even more tantalizing puzzle. Over the decades, hundreds of hair specimens have been collected from locations where Bigfoot sightings occurred, snagged on branches, found in nesting sites, or left behind at feeding areas. When subjected to microscopic analysis, a significant percentage of these samples were easily identified as bear, elk, buffalo, or human hair, but a troubling minority defied easy classification. Laboratory reports described them as primate hair from an unknown species, exhibiting characteristics that fell between human and known ape hair in terms of scale pattern, medulla structure, and cortical thickness. The problem, as always, was verification. Hair analysis can suggest, but without intact follicles containing nuclear DNA, it cannot prove. Most samples yielded only mitochondrial DNA, which provides limited information. In 2013, a comprehensive genetic study led by Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes analyzed dozens of supposed Yeti and Bigfoot hair samples from around the world. The results were deflating for believers. Nearly every sample matched known animals. The supposed Bigfoot hairs came from bears, horses, cows, and in one memorable case, a North American porcupine. Yet Sykes himself acknowledged that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. His study examined only the samples submitted to him, a tiny fraction of those collected over the years. Then there are the Sierra Sounds, audio recordings that remain among the most perplexing evidence in Bigfoot research. In the early 1970s, outdoorsman Ron Moorhead and his hunting party recorded strange vocalizations in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. Over multiple camping trips, they captured hours of bizarre sounds, chattering, whooping, whistling, and what appeared to be complex exchanges between multiple creatures. The recordings were analyzed by several acoustical engineers and linguists who noted that the sounds contained frequencies and patterns unlike known North American wildlife. University of Wyoming professors R. Lynn Curlin and Lawrence Lekis conducted spectrographic analysis of the Sierra Sounds, concluding that if they were hoaxes, they were extraordinarily sophisticated ones. The recordings demonstrated vocal characteristics, suggesting a much larger vocal apparatus than humans possess, with formant frequencies that implied a vocal tract of unusual dimensions. Some exchanges seemed almost conversational, with apparent back-and-forth communication between distinct voices. Yet once again, unusual does not mean definitive. Without the creature that made these sounds, they remain acoustic mysteries, unexplained but not inexplicable. Cross the Pacific Ocean, climb into the thin air of the Himalayas, and the evidence becomes even more sparse and controversial. The Yeti, that legendary snowman of Tibetan folklore, has left behind far fewer physical traces than its North American counterpart. The most famous artifact was the Pangbo She hand, a withered appendage kept for generations in a Buddhist monastery in Nepal. Climbers reported seeing it as early as the 1950s, and in 1959, a piece of bone was allegedly smuggled out by primatologist W.C. Osman Hill and expedition financier Tom Slick. That bone fragment eventually underwent DNA testing in 2011, and the results were anticlimactic. It was human. The monk's sacred relic was nothing more than a preserved human hand, possibly from a holy man or lama, misidentified through decades of myth-making and wishful thinking. The revelation highlighted a recurring problem with Yeti evidence: Cultural artifacts become cryptozoological specimens through a telephone game of assumption and misidentification. The scalp specimens told a similar story. Monasteries across Nepal and Tibet possessed cone-shaped, reddish-brown pelts that monks claimed came from Yetis. When Edmund Hillary obtained samples during his 1960 expedition and brought them to Western scientists, analysis suggested they were from Himalayan serows, a type of goat antelope native to the region. Later testing in 2008 confirmed the sero identification for some specimens, while others proved to be from Himalayan bears. But the most explosive Yeti evidence emerged in 2013, when Brian Sykes published his Oxford-Lausanne study results. 2 hair samples from the Himalayas, one from Ladakh in India, and another from Bhutan, matched an ancient polar bear species that lived 40,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. Could an isolated population of prehistoric polar bears be surviving in the Himalayas, occasionally descending to lower elevations where terrified witnesses mistook them for ape men? The theory is scientifically plausible, yet geographically problematic. Modern polar bears are highly specialized for Arctic environments, dependent on sea ice and marine mammals for survival. How such a population could adapt to and survive in the Himalayas for 40 millennia strains credibility, yet the genetic match was undeniable. Subsequent analysis suggested the possibility of contamination or mislabeling, but Sykes stood by his finding. The mystery deepened, rather than resolved. For Bigfoot research, credibility took a devastating blow in August of 2008, when 2 men from Georgia held a press conference claiming they had found a Bigfoot body. Matthew Whitten and Rick Dyer presented photographs of what appeared to be a massive, hair-covered corpse frozen in a block of ice. They partnered with Bigfoot researcher Tom Biscardi, who promoted the discovery with breathless enthusiasm. DNA tests were promised. Scientific examination would be conducted. The cryptozoology community held its breath. The ice melted, literally and figuratively. Inside the block was a rubber gorilla costume, stuffed with roadkill and frozen as an elaborate hoax. The press conference had been watched by mainstream media outlets worldwide, and the revelation turned Bigfoot research into a punchline for late-night comedians. Legitimate researchers were tarred with the same brush, their years of careful documentation dismissed because of 2 fraudsters seeking fame and profit. The Georgia hoax demonstrated how a single spectacular deception could undermine decades of earnest investigation. This raises a crucial question. Why does Yeti evidence remain so much more limited than Bigfoot evidence? Is it simply the extreme remoteness of the Himalayas, where human presence is sparse and documentation difficult? Or does it suggest genuine rarity, perhaps even non-existence? The Himalayas present extraordinary challenges for evidence collection. The terrain is among the most inhospitable on Earth, accessible only during narrow weather windows, with vast areas completely unexplored by modern science. Witnesses in these regions are often local people whose reports are filtered through cultural interpretations that Westerners struggle to contextualize. Modern technology is now being deployed in both searches, but with vastly different approaches and results. In North America, the proliferation of trail cameras has created an unexpected problem for Bigfoot researchers. These motion-activated cameras now number in the millions, deployed by hunters, wildlife researchers, and property owners across the continent. They capture everything from common deer to rare wolverines, documenting wildlife with relentless efficiency. Yet, they have failed to produce a single verified image of Bigfoot. Believers argue the creatures are intelligent enough to avoid cameras, or that compelling images exist but remain in private hands. Skeptics point to this absence as damning evidence that no large, unknown primate roams North American forests. Drones have opened the Himalayan highlands to aerial surveillance, documenting previously inaccessible valleys and slopes. Expeditions now deploy these flying cameras to survey vast territories in days rather than weeks, yet the Yeti remains elusive. Some researchers suggest that if the creature exists, it occupies ecological niches even drones cannot easily access. Deep caves, dense rhododendron forests, or high-altitude regions where weather conditions prevent sustained drone operation. The most promising technology may be environmental DNA sampling. This technique analyzes water and soil samples for genetic material shed by creatures through skin cells, hair, feces, and saliva. Every animal leaves traces of its DNA in the environment, and modern sequencing can identify species from minute quantities. Researchers have begun deploying EDNA sampling in both Bigfoot and Yeti territories, collecting water from streams, soil from suspected nesting sites, and even air samples from enclosed valley systems. Early results have been mundane. The DNA recovered identifies known species: bears, deer, small mammals, birds. Nothing anomalous has appeared in peer-reviewed studies. Yet the technology is still developing, and vast territories remain unsampled. Believers maintain hope that expanded EDNA surveys will eventually capture genetic material from an unknown primate. Skeptics counter that if such a creature existed in the numbers necessary for a breeding population, its DNA would already have been detected. What recent findings suggest is not the existence of unknown primates, but rather the extraordinary diversity of Earth's wildlife that remains imperfectly cataloged. New species are discovered regularly, though usually they are insects, fish, or small mammals. Large primates require vast territories, substantial food resources, and populations large enough to maintain genetic diversity. The ecological footprint of a North American ape or Himalayan snowman should be obvious, yet it remains invisible to modern science. The physical evidence, viewed comprehensively, presents a paradox. There is too much to dismiss entirely, yet never quite enough to confirm definitively. Thousands of footprint casts cannot all be hoaxes, yet none prove beyond doubt that an unknown primate exists. Hair samples with unusual characteristics hint at something unexplained, but DNA testing keeps identifying known animals. Audio recordings capture sounds that defy easy explanation, but sound alone cannot establish a new species. And always, the hoaxes lurk in the background, poisoning the well of genuine inquiry, making it nearly impossible to distinguish authentic mysteries from deliberate deception. The woods remember what we try to forget. In the case files and incident reports, in the testimonies of survivors and the silence of those who never returned, there exists a pattern that transforms folklore into something far more disturbing. When we move beyond tracking footprints and analyzing blurry photographs, we enter territory where the question is no longer whether these creatures exist, but rather how many lives they may have claimed. David Paulides spent decades as a law enforcement officer before he began investigating what he calls the missing 411 cases. These are disappearances that occur in North American national parks and wilderness areas, vanishings that share peculiar characteristics and defy conventional explanation. What caught Paulides' attention, what pulled him deeper into this research than he ever intended to go, was the geographical overlap. When he mapped the disappearances and compared them to reported Bigfoot sightings and activity hotspots, the correlation was impossible to ignore. The clusters align with disturbing precision. The Dennis Martin case remains one of the most haunting in Paulides' extensive documentation. On June 14, 1969, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 6-year-old Dennis Martin vanished while playing with other children near Spencefield. The case would become one of the most intensive searches in park history, involving the FBI, the National Park Service, the Army, and hundreds of volunteers. What transforms this from a tragic disappearance into something far more sinister are the witness statements that park officials seemed reluctant to emphasize in their official reports. Key Hobbs, an experienced outdoorsman, was in the area at the time of Dennis's disappearance. What he reported seeing has never been adequately explained or investigated to the satisfaction of those who believe something terrible happened on that mountain. Hobbs stated that he saw what he described as a wild man, covered in hair, moving rapidly through the forest. This figure was not alone. According to Hobbs, it appeared to be carrying something over its shoulder, something roughly the size and weight of a small child. The timing of this sighting aligned almost perfectly with the moment Dennis Martin left his playmates and disappeared into the tree line. The search parties found strange evidence. There were footprints discovered in the area, prints that did not match the barefoot pattern of a lost 6-year-old boy. Some searchers reported finding tracks that were far too large, with a stride length that exceeded normal human capability. Weather moved in quickly after Dennis vanished, rain washing away potential evidence and making scent tracking nearly impossible for the search dogs. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case involved the canine units. Multiple tracking dogs, highly trained animals with successful search records, reached a certain point on the mountain and simply refused to continue. They would sit down, whine, and pull back toward the handlers with visible distress. Experienced dog handlers stated this was behavior they associated with animals detecting something that triggered primal fear. Dennis Martin was never found. No remains, no clothing, no definitive trace, despite one of the most comprehensive search efforts ever mounted in the American wilderness. The official conclusion was that the boy became lost and succumbed to exposure, that his small body was simply never recovered from the vast forested terrain. But those who investigated the case more deeply, who spoke with witnesses like Key Hobbs away from official channels, came away believing something else entirely. They believed Dennis Martin was taken, carried away by something that had been watching those children from the forest edge, something that moved with purpose and speed when the opportunity presented itself. The Robert Morgan case from 1978 presents an even more direct claim of fatal violence. Morgan was a logger working in the remote wilderness of southeastern Oregon, part of a two-man team operating in an area where Bigfoot reports had circulated for generations among the local logging community. According to Morgan's testimony, given to local authorities, and later documented by researchers, he and his partner had been working a section of old-growth forest when they began experiencing unusual occurrences. Equipment would be moved overnight, their camp disturbed in ways that didn't match bear or other known animal behavior. They heard vocalizations in the darkness, sounds that Morgan described as definitely not from any creature he recognized despite his years in the woods. On the day of the incident, Morgan stated that he and his partner had separated, each working their assigned area within shouting distance of each other. Morgan heard sounds of a struggle, heard his partner scream, a sound he described as pure terror cut suddenly short. When he reached the location where his partner had been working, he found evidence of violence. Blood, a lot of it, marked the trees and ground. His partner's equipment was scattered, some of it damaged with what Morgan stated was incredible force. And then he saw it, watching from the edge of the clearing. Morgan described a creature standing over 8 feet tall, massively built, covered in dark hair. Most terrifying was what it held in its hands, what Morgan believed to be part of his partner's body, though he admitted his memory of those specific moments remained fragmented. Possibly the mind's way of protecting itself from the full horror of what he witnessed. Morgan ran. Key. He fled the forest and reached the nearest town in a state of shock, severe enough that medical personnel were called before law enforcement. When search teams returned to the site, they found blood evidence that confirmed violence had occurred, but Robert Morgan's partner was never found. The official conclusion, absent a body or definitive proof, was logged as a missing person case with animal attack listed as probable cause. But Morgan maintained until his death that what he saw was no bear, no cougar, nothing cataloged in wildlife management texts. He saw a Sasquatch, and it had killed his partner with brutal efficiency. Across the Pacific, in the Himalayan regions where the Yeti maintains its stronghold in local belief and fear, similar accounts exist. The 1974 incident near the village of Makermo in Nepal involved a young Sherpa girl tending yaks in high pastures. Villagers heard the animals in distress, heard sounds they described as terrifying, unlike anything produced by snow leopards or other predators they knew well. When men from the village reached the pasture area, they found the yaks scattered and panicked. The girl was dead, her body showing injuries that local authorities struggled to explain. The wounds were not consistent with a big cat attack or a bear, both of which leave distinctive patterns that experienced mountain people can readily identify. What witnesses described were massive crushing injuries, damage that suggested incredible blunt force combined with an almost human-like grasping pattern. There were marks on the girl's body that suggested large hands, proportioned like human hands but far too big, and with strength indicators that exceeded normal parameters. The yaks, hardy animals not easily frightened, were found as far as a mile from the attack site, still in a state of terror hours later. The few locals who would speak about the incident to outside researchers stated plainly that a Yeti had killed the girl, that such attacks, while rare, were known to happen when humans ventured too far into territory the creatures considered their own. Solo climbers in the Himalayas have been found dead in circumstances that defy easy explanation. These are experienced mountaineers, people who understand the dangers and know how to avoid the documented hazards. Yet bodies have been discovered showing trauma that doesn't match falls, avalanches, or environmental exposure. In regions where no large predators exist at those elevations, climbers have been found with massive crushing injuries, with evidence suggesting they fought against something before their deaths. The 1986 testimony from a survivor of an alleged Yeti attack provides rare first-hand detail. The individual, an experienced trekker whose identity has been protected at their request, described being attacked at dusk while establishing camp in a remote area of the Tibetan Plateau. According to the testimony documented by researchers, the attack came with shocking speed. The survivor described a massive figure emerging from behind rock formations, upright and moving, with purpose directly toward the camp. The creature struck with what the survivor described as almost casual force, a single blow that fractured ribs and sent them tumbling across the rocky ground. What saved this person's life, according to their account, was not fighting back or any action of their own, but rather the behavior of the creature itself. After the initial violent contact, the Yeti, and the survivor insisted this was the only term that fit what they encountered, appeared to study them. It came close enough that the smell was overwhelming, a powerful musk mixed with the odor of decay. It vocalized sounds the survivor stated were unmistakably communicative, even if the meaning remained unknown. Then, for reasons the survivor could not explain, the creature left, moving away into the gathering darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. The survivor was evacuated with serious injuries, but survived to provide their testimony. What makes this account particularly compelling to researchers is the clinical detail in the description and the survivor's obvious reluctance to share the experience. This was not someone seeking attention or trying to sell a story. This was someone deeply traumatized, someone who required extensive psychological support following the incident, and someone who expressed certainty that they had been assessed by the creature and found not worth killing, a realization they found almost as disturbing as the attack itself. When we examine the attack patterns attributed to these creatures across different geographical regions, certain consistencies emerge. The violence, when it occurs, appears to be overwhelming and immediate. Witnesses describe massive strength, the ability to kill quickly with blunt force trauma. Injuries reported in alleged attacks involve crushing damage, massive soft tissue trauma, and patterns suggesting the use of hands or appendages with grip strength, far exceeding human capability. Some researchers who have analyzed these patterns note similarities to primate violence, the way large apes like gorillas or orangutans fight, using their incredible strength to grab, crush, and tear rather than claw or bite like predatory cats or bears. The question of motive remains deeply troubling. Do these creatures kill for food? The evidence is mixed and disturbing. In some cases, bodies are never recovered, leaving open the horrifying possibility of predation. In other instances, victims are found but do not show evidence of being consumed, suggesting killing for territorial defense or perhaps in response to perceived threats. Some researchers have proposed a third possibility that many find most disturbing of all, that these creatures may kill in ways similar to how other great apes occasionally kill, not for food or clear defense, but as a display of dominance, as aggression that serves social purposes within their own species hierarchy. Expert analysis of the theoretical killing capability of creatures matching Bigfoot or Yeti descriptions produces sobering conclusions. If we accept the reported size ranges, creatures standing between 7 and 10 feet tall with proportionate mass and musculature, we are discussing beings with strength levels that would dwarf even the most powerful human athletes. Primatologists who study gorillas note that these animals, despite being generally peaceful and avoiding conflict when possible, possess the capability to kill humans with terrifying ease if motivated to violence. A silverback gorilla can generate crushing force measured in thousands of pounds per square inch with its grip alone. If Bigfoot or Yeti are real and represent some form of undiscovered primate, possibly even a relict hominid species that has survived in isolated wilderness areas, their strength would logically exceed that of gorillas given the larger size parameters consistently reported. We would be discussing creatures capable of killing adult humans as easily as an adult human might dispatch a small animal, with minimal effort and overwhelming force. The speed reported in encounters suggests explosive power, the ability to cover ground and close distance faster than a human could react, much less escape. The psychological profile implied by witness accounts is perhaps most disturbing. These are not mindless killing machines, not simple predators operating on instinct alone. The reports suggest intelligence, planning, and decision-making. The Dennis Martin case, if we accept Key Hobbs's testimony as accurate, implies patience and opportunism, waiting and watching for the right moment. The survivor of the Yeti attack described being evaluated, examined in a way that suggested conscious choice about whether to kill or spare. This intelligence, combined with lethal capability, creates a threat profile unlike anything else in the wilderness, something that thinks and decides and possesses the power to act on those decisions with deadly efficiency. We are left with a pattern that transforms the question of existence into something far more urgent. The evidence, circumstantial and controversial though it may be, suggests that people have died in wilderness areas under circumstances that do not fit conventional explanation. Whether we are looking at undiscovered species protecting territory, relict hominids responding to human encroachment, or something else entirely, the possibility that intelligence and lethal force combine in these creatures makes every unexplained disappearance in Bigfoot hotspots a potential crime scene where the perpetrator remains unidentified and free to kill again. After decades of investigation, thousands of reported encounters, and countless hours of research, we stand at an uncomfortable crossroads. Despite all our technological advances, despite satellites that can read license plates from space and cameras that capture wildlife in the most remote corners of the planet, we still cannot definitively prove or disprove the existence of Bigfoot and the Yeti. Yet the evidence doesn't stop accumulating. If anything, it grows more complex, more puzzling, more resistant to easy dismissal with each passing year. The question that haunts researchers is perhaps more unsettling than a simple yes or no about existence. What exactly are we dealing with here? The rational mind wants to categorize these creatures as undiscovered primates, remnant populations of Gigantopithecus, or some other hominid that survived extinction in isolated pockets of wilderness. But the evidence refuses to fit neatly into that box. Witnesses describe behaviors that seem almost supernatural, abilities that defy biological explanation, creatures that vanish without a trace despite snow that should hold their tracks, beings that seem to know exactly where cameras are placed, as if possessing some sixth sense that alerts them to human technology. Some researchers have ventured into even stranger territory, proposing theories that would have been laughed out of scientific circles just decades ago. Could these entities exist partially outside our normal understanding of physical reality? The interdimensional hypothesis sounds like science fiction, yet it's been seriously discussed by investigators who've spent years chasing evidence that simply doesn't behave the way evidence of flesh and blood animals should behave. Thermal signatures that appear and vanish. Vocalizations that seem to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The maddening way physical traces seem to dissolve or disappear when investigators return with proper equipment. Consider the most recent cases from 2023 and 2024. Evidence so fresh, the files are still being compiled. In the Pacific Northwest, multiple hikers reported finding tracks in early 2024 that measured 19 inches long, with a stride length of over 6 feet. The tracks appeared in an area covered by fresh snowfall that had stopped just hours before their discovery. Weather data confirmed no precipitation for a 12-hour window, yet the tracks showed no signs of melting or degradation that would indicate they'd been there when the snow fell. They simply appeared in pristine snow, leading up a steep embankment that would challenge even experienced climbers, then vanished at a rock face with no indication of where the creature went next. In the Himalayas, an expedition team in late 2023 captured thermal footage of something moving across a glacier at an elevation where no known animal should survive for an extended period. The figure walked upright, crossed nearly a mile of open ice in less than 20 minutes, a pace that would exhaust even the fittest human at that altitude, and disappeared into a crevasse field that the team later found impassable. No tracks, no hair samples, no physical evidence remained despite the team reaching the location within 3 hours of the sighting. The surveillance technology paradox grows more pronounced every year. We have more trail cameras in the wilderness than ever before. Hikers carry phones with cameras more sophisticated than professional equipment from just a decade ago. Drones can access terrain humans never could. Yet clear, unambiguous footage remains elusive. The skeptic says this proves nothing is there. But investigators counter with an unsettling point. If these creatures have survived undetected for millennia, perhaps they've evolved or learned to detect and avoid our technology. Perhaps their very survival depended on becoming invisible to human observation. Why do sightings continue if there's nothing there to see? The psychological explanation that people misidentify bears or other known animals falls apart when you examine the consistency of descriptions across cultures that had no contact with each other. The physiological details witnesses report, the specific behaviors, the intelligence displayed and how these creatures avoid capture, all point to something more than mass hallucination or mistaken identity. The truth is, we may be asking the wrong questions entirely. Perhaps the issue isn't whether Bigfoot and the Yeti exist in the way we understand existence. Perhaps consciousness, reality, and the natural world operate on principles we're only beginning to glimpse. Quantum physics has already shown us that observation itself changes outcomes at the subatomic level. Who's to say there aren't larger principles at work, phenomena that exist in the margins of our perception, becoming real only under certain conditions we don't yet understand how to replicate or study? What we can say with certainty is this: something is happening in these remote places. Experienced outdoors people who've spent their entire lives in the wilderness, people with no reason to fabricate stories or seek attention, continue to report encounters that terrify them, that change them, that leave them certain they've encountered something science hasn't cataloged. Their testimonies carry the weight of genuine trauma, genuine awe, genuine fear. The evidence remains tantalizingly incomplete, forever just beyond the threshold of proof. But it doesn't disappear. It accumulates in ways that resist simple dismissal. And for those who venture into the deep wilderness, the remote mountains, the places where human presence is the exception rather than the rule, the theoretical nature of this mystery becomes suddenly, viscerally real. Whether these creatures exist as flesh and blood animals, as something more exotic, or as manifestations of forces we don't yet comprehend, the practical reality is the same. If you find yourself in their territory, if you encounter something that doesn't fit your understanding of what should be there, those 6 differences we've explored might be the only tool you have to assess the situation and respond appropriately. The next time you're alone in the deep woods, when the sun drops below the tree line and the familiar forest becomes something ancient and unknowable, remember this: if you hear something moving in the darkness, if you catch a glimpse of something massive between the trees, if you smell that overwhelming stench that has no natural source, those differences matter. The build, the gait, the face, the habitat, the behavior, the sounds. Each detail tells you something crucial about what you're facing. Because in that moment, the academic debates don't matter. The question of proof becomes irrelevant. What matters is recognizing the signs, understanding the danger, and knowing that whether science has cataloged these creatures or not, you are not alone in that wilderness. Something is there with you. Something that has survived by remaining hidden, by being smarter, stronger, and more adapted to that environment than you could ever be. The mystery endures not because we lack the tools to solve it, but because perhaps it's a mystery that exists beyond the reach of tools. And that might be the most unsettling possibility of all. That there are still things in this world, things that share our planet, our forests, our mountains, that operate outside our ability to capture, classify, and control. Things that remind us, in the most primal way possible, that for all our technology and advancement, we are still visitors in the wild places, and we are not the apex presence there. The evidence continues. The sightings persist. The mystery deepens. And somewhere, in the remote corners of the world, where human footprints are rare and nature still holds dominion, these creatures, whatever they are, continue their existence in the shadows between the known and the unknown. Whether you believe or doubt, whether you seek them or avoid them, they remain. And that alone should give anyone pause before venturing too deep, too far, too confidently into the wilderness that is still, in so many ways, not ours at all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.